buzzing through the walls, making their honey and singing their song. They say I worked for the queen all day. Yeah, I worked for the queen all day. Yeah.
Hello, the Queen Bee's Hive. This is Angela, and here we are at the end of part 1 with chapter 10, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. A wonderful end to this first section where we see more of the lion that surrounds the honey of the Mackenzie's return that the section title references. You know, yes, that's honey and it's sweet, but there was a lot of lion around that made a home for that honey to happen. So, so it kind of, is the main idea of this story, of this chapter, is to finally, after all of that, we'll tell you later stuff, we finally get the rest of the story of how the Macs returned to the ridge and got here in the right time, and all that they went through in the process of that. It sounded really terrifying, especially with 2 little kids, but that's the primary focus. But there are some undercurrent messages as well that I am sure will even become more vivid when I finish this book and I start my reread and my prep for our deep dive. But I already kind of see some things, and I'll point those out. We pick up a week after the last chapter. So I'm thinking that means we're near the end of July here. Again, we're in Claire's POV, and we start with this very homey scene. Everyone besides the Macs and Frasers are gone. Jermaine and Fanny are at the Murrays combing their goats. I guess combing goats is a thing. That's a major job that you need a whole crew of people to do, I guess. Or maybe it's just they thought it sounded fun. But Jemmy had sprained his thumb, so he stayed home. So we have the scene of him playing chess with Jamie. It's all very domestic, with Bree and Claire, you know, taking care of all the 18th century house stuff, kneading dough, soaking venison, cleaning the floor, all these things. And then there's my Roger, who has made himself a mountain dulcimer and is picking out Scarborough Fair. Now, I kind of went down a wee rabbit hole with this, as you probably saw, and I have to also blame Diana herself because she contributed to that because of a little bit of messaging I had with her, which I'll get into in a minute. So you likely saw before this video, I published 2 posts on the meaning and history of this timeless song, as well as the symbolism of the herbs and so forth. Also, in the description of this post below, I included someone playing this very song on a mountain dulcimer so that you, my friends, can put yourself right in that cabin listening to Roger and see exactly what it looked like and sounded like. Of course, he made it, so I'm sure it's not as nice as this dulcimer, but still, we can kind of visualize. So yes, I am the nerd of all nerds. But the thing is, something told me that this song choice was going to be important for a few reasons. For one, Roger is playing this music, so it's a deal. If you see Roger physically playing this, it's kind of like you want to pay attention to it. 2, it is the title of the chapter. It's part of the title of the chapter. 3, it's the final chapter of a section. And 4, it's the climactic chapter that tells the rest of the Mac story. And the song itself has like this sense of mystery and timelessness about it. And for good reason. It is that reason why the song itself represents the chapter itself and represents the elements of this book as a whole. So this particular song is important. That's why I spent some time on it, and I'll probably spend more time, when we do our deep dive. But I'm not going to get too far in the weeds here in this reaction, but expect us to do more on it when we get to the deep dive. I will share one exciting little thing, though, with you guys. I had a private exchange with Diana, and this exact thing came up in our exchange. I wanted to set up an interview with her for a follow-up piece for the blog. I don't know if you know, some of you that are newer, but I interviewed her 2 years ago on the progress of bees at that time and on the upcoming season 5. So I wanted to approach her to do a follow-up interview post bees to talk about, the breakdown of bees and also prior to the 6th season. So it would kind of be like a mirror, a follow-up blog to the one I did before, which she granted in our exchange, which means I really need to start cranking these out because I have to have this book finished before I do this interview. However, while I had her attention, I squeezed in a question that's been kind of niggling at me, and her answer was brilliant and fantastic. I'm not going to get into all of it here because I plan to include it in my piece, and I want to kind of keep it as an insight to reveal there. However, I can give you a little bit that has to do with this chapter because she mentions this chapter in what she sent me specifically. Which was like really kismet because here I was about to roll out this chapter. So it kind of felt like very serendipitous that she mentioned it and talked all about this in her response to me. I asked her about all the prolific music and lyric references in this book, as we see in this chapter. I told her that I know that she always has quite a bit of musical reference in all of her books because she has a musical background herself. She incorporates that a lot in her books, but it seems to be very saturated in this book. We see a ton of music lyrics and music titles and pop song references in just the titles. And I've already noticed a little bit in the interior text as well. And so much more than what we've seen in past books. So much so that it seemed to be intentional and purposeful is what I said to her. So I said, if so, what was your intention with this little bit of craft that you did there with all of the song titles? Like, what were you trying to say with that? And in her answer, she gave me a little wee spoiler or two, one that wasn't so wee, but thankfully it was a wag that I had for a long time. And so, and I told everybody this wag as well. You guys will know, I'll mention it when we get there. But so she basically confirmed what I wagged, but I haven't actually seen it yet play out in the book. But I'll dance around it here. In a nutshell, what she said was that the music is, and I quote, "It is to create a recurrent echo of the future reaching into the past now that Bree and Roger, spoiler, are there. They may try to be sub rosa, but people carry a lot of their temporal context with them all the time, and it seeps out." So she talked about a couple other spoilery things in Frank's book, which, if you heard the excerpt in the launch party, that's pretty much kind of the gist of what she talked about. And she talked about Jamie's sense of foreboding from Frank's book, and that while Jamie can't hear music, he clearly hears Frank singing to him. And the knowledge of this foreboding is not always front and center, but it's always there, like the lyrics of a half-heard song while you're doing something else. So she said the whole book is set in the past, and naturally so are most of Roger and Brianna's current concerns and preoccupations. But the past, or rather the future, lingers. And that kind of made song titles float to the top of my mind, and the whole notion of song and temporal context kind of focuses in Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, chapter 10, where Roger explicates Bree and Roger's dilemma to keep the kids from causing undue notice by singing Twist and Shout in church, for instance, while still letting them keep some remnants of their real time in case they go back. So, which I thought was fascinating, Now, she said more, but that was the gist of what she said that I want to bring attention to here. Now, this chapter itself bridges together the future and the past, and how Roger and Bree got to this present of 1779. But that particular song is a metaphor of their story. I know I sound like I'm doing the lesson. I just kind of got, I got one of you said to me, Angela, you're doing too much in these, you're not going to have nothing left to teach. I will have stuff left to teach. I know I sound like I'm doing my deep dive thing by saying this, but it's the end of a section. So I will stop doing this much. I promise. Anyway, this chapter itself, the content, I'm saying as much as I am now because this is the final chapter of the section, and it also kind of wraps the section, so I'm giving a little more here. The way I see it, it bridges together the future, the past, and how Roger and Bree got to this present. You see all three in this kind of chapter referenced. This particular song is a metaphor of their story because it fuses, if you looked at my extras, two songs from different time periods into one, in a medieval time period and a future time period, one in counterpoint to the other, which is like, and it's like a canticle, and some of it fuses and echoing ideas into this one beautiful song through two different perspectives. And it's a really beautiful song filled with magic and mystery and the unknown, and kind of an element of fairy to it, and love spells and different things like that. So it kind of fits the tone, and it kind of is a metaphor of the story that Roger and Bree are telling. It's also kind of like a little bittersweet, that song, It's a lovely song, but it has like a little bittersweet element to it, which is basically, yes, it's lovely that Max are here, but there's a little bit of a bittersweetness to it when you hear the story, Later, things are quiet, and the chess match had ended, and Jamie, by heroic effort, had managed to lose. And the dulcimer had fallen silent. Mandy and Jemmy had both fallen asleep, and the four adults gathered together around the table with 4 cups and a bottle of decent red wine, a gift of Michael Lindsay for my helping in stitching up a couple long wounds in the flank of his horse. These the result of a run-in with a bear. Now, here we have another bear attack and a run-in with this mentioned bear, okay? So we aren't done with the bear. The bear is definitely going to come back around into something because they keep bringing it up, this aggressive bear out there. So they get their wine and they're gathered around the table, and Jamie tells Roger that his dulcimer sounds bonny. And Roger is surprised, and he wants to know if Jamie is able to make out that it's a song. And so Jamie says, no, surprised in turn. Was it a song? The sound it makes is nice though, like wee bells ringing. It's a song from our time, Brianna said, a little hesitant. I glanced at the children. It's all right, Roger assured her. The lyrics to that one could have come from any time from the Middle Ages on. So he's referencing that time difference in the song. That's good. We need to be careful, Bree said, with a half smile at me. We just as soon not have Mandy singing Twist and Shout in church. So again, Roger is bringing up here in this conversation about how the origins of that type of music came from churches in that time. And you see what Diana is saying here and what Roger is saying. The concern about the idea of the future linking into the past, because as much as you might try to be careful, your temporal context is so ingrained in you that it will leach out. And it reminds me of a daily lines that I went over with you guys when we were doing our Moby study, and I would do the daily lines. And it was one where Buck gave Roger, it was a flashback scene where we were in full flashback with Buck. And he gave Roger the sapphire, and Roger tried to get him to come with them. And Jen was playing with another boy rolling a big hoop on the ground. You guys recall this daily line? And Mandy grabbed it and spun it around her middle and said, "Look, Daddy, a hula hoop." And everybody froze. And Buck and Roger talked about this very issue. Okay, and I think it was Diana again making this point, and we saw Buck said, what's a hula hoop then? And he said, it's nothing, it's a children's toy. Nobody cares what a little girl says, and who cares about a toy? People say nonsense. But he was nervous, and Buck said, but she might say other things that people will pay attention to, right? And it was just kind of left off there. And so it's kind of that same idea. By the way, do you know that daily line is not going to be in this book? I saw a list of daily lines that never made it into the final book. And I cannot believe how many there are on this list. I was stunned because Lane always says that once she makes something a daily line, it's, she's pretty much solid on it, but sometimes they get moved around. So I expect like a few not going to make it, for whatever reason, or maybe she ended the book sooner than she thought it could push to another book or whatever. But there were so many, there were so many on this list, at least like 25 of the daily lines that were on this list. And I did not expect that. I'm really kind of bummed that scene is not going to be in the book because I loved it so much. So I'm really upset. It was a little bit heartbreaking to see that list, to be honest with you. I kind of feel like I sometimes feel when I watch the first watch of an episode of the TV show, which is what I call the purge watch, because it's where I cleanse all my expectations that I may have had from my book knowledge that the show didn't do or they did differently, and it kind of hits me wrong, like what's not here that I expected, that type of thing. And then I have to like watch it again now that I kind of know that's not going to be there, and I kind of watch it again. I feel like that's going to be the case with this book because we spend so much time wagging, reading daily lines, kind of imagining how it's all going to fit, how this line's going to fit, and how that line's going to fit, and what that means, and all this. And now, if she's going to take out 25 of them, like things we banked on aren't going to be there, and like it's all kind of not what I thought then, different things. So I'm a little bit sad about a few that were on this list that aren't going to be there. And that's definitely the flashback one with Buck. I was looking forward to that whole chapter to see what else was there. I was excited to read the rest of it. Anyway, that was a great illustration of the principle that she is trying to drive home in this chapter and in the book as a whole. And that's why she did all of these song titles and so forth, to kind of keep it front and center to people, like with the pop culture references, that even though this book, she says it's entirely set in the past, it's keeping that future always kind of in the forefront, that these are people that are from a different time. And so by using all of these modern reference titles and song culture titles and all of that kind of stuff, that's what the purpose of it was, which I thought was really interesting. And there's also some other stuff she said about Frank's book that I won't get into until we get there. Then we get another snake reference. Roger says, I wonder if there are any snake handling churches in the area, he added, suddenly interested. I don't know when that started. Snakes in church on purpose? Jamie said dubiously. Why the devil would anybody do that? Mark 16:17, Roger said, and these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name they shall cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. They do it or will do it to prove their faith, he explained. Pick up rattlesnakes and cottonmouths with their bare hands in church. Jesus Christ, Jamie said, and crossed himself. Exactly, Roger nodded. Anything in the Bible safe, he said to Bree, but we maybe don't want to dwell on things that might suggest more modern things. I had glanced involuntarily at my hands when Roger quoted the Bible verse, but looked up at this. Jamie looked blank. So this first snake reference, I'm thinking possibly it's put here because they're about to tell this twisting, ominous tale of their return. So if we are looking at snake mentions as some type of a cue or an omen, them putting that here right before they tell this story might be what they're doing with that, I'm thinking. So also note Claire is looking at her hands and hearing the line in the Bible verse of they shall lay hands on the sick and they shall recover. So another nod at the end of her blue light quest in this book. So Bree explains, it's not that we want them to forget, she said quietly. There will be people and things they loved from our time. And we don't know whether they might sometime eventually go back. But we have to be careful which memories from that time we keep among us and talk about. Remember, and I saw her throat bob slightly as she swallowed. It probably wouldn't cause any trouble if Mandy told people about toilets, for instance, especially not if I build one, she added, breaking into a brief smile. But there are other things. Said Jamie softly, I suppose there are. He laid a hand on my thigh, and I covered it. I could see what he saw, the looks on their faces. Roger and Brianna both. I'd seen it in the days near the end of World War II. He'd seen it in the months and years after Culloden. The look of exiles, necessity covering mourning, bravery turning away from memories that would never be left behind no matter how deeply they were buried. So that last line again reiterates this message Diana is getting across. Also, do you think Jen and or Mandy will go back eventually, maybe in book 10? Is that little bit that she said there like a bit of foreshadowing, do you think? So now we get down to the nitty gritty, and Jamie says, I ken why you came back, he said, but how? And we hear all the thought process that they knew they had to sail to America. Do they try to go to Craignadoon in 1739 to travel to 1779 and then travel across the sea to North Carolina? Or do they sail now to Ocracoke, make the jump at Ocracoke to 1779. And so in their debating, we kind of get their thought process. They said that they knew Ocracoke had ended in death for some people, but then they also knew that the four of them had done it from there before and made it okay. They thought of the Springers group that ended in different times, which really terrifies them especially after just coming back from them being separated from Roger. So this whole thing must have been really hard for them, knowing that they have kids. It's different if you're just adults dealing with something like this, but knowing you're dragging your kids into this has to be kind of terrifying. Bree says maybe the Montauk Five had a different experience because they went in one at a time instead of all together. Jamie says, so it came down to a question of ships. No, Jamie had been sitting intent, fingers tapping lightly on his thigh, but now straightened up. Would there be a great difference, do you think, between a ship built in 1739 and one built in 1775 or so? Yes, Brianna said with some emphasis. Ships got bigger and faster, but weather is weather, and if you run into an iceberg or a hurricane, she nodded at me, it doesn't matter that much whether you're in a rowboat or the Titanic. No, it doesn't, Jamie agreed, and I laughed. I told him briefly about the Titanic. From your point of view, a floating plank on the trout pond would be just as bad as the Queen Mary, and that's a really big ship, by the way. I expect the food would be better on the latter, he said, unperturbed by my teasing. And as long as you had your wee stabbers in my face, I could choose on that basis. So did you ken whether the weather changed a great deal in 40 years, he asked, returning the conversation to Bree, who shook her head. Not the storms and wind type of weather, I mean. It might have, but we have no way of knowing that. What we did know, though, was the political weather. So I really loved seeing Jamie so engaged into this conversation. He is so much more comfortable. If you recall how he was around these conversations back in like Fiery Cross and Drums of Autumn, and even a little bit in the early parts of A Breath of Snow and Ashes, he used to feel like really out of his element and all of that stuff, when they would talk about time travel and all these things. But now, he's so much more comfortable and engaged and participating. It's like he's one of them now. He's kind of like, this is old news to me. Like let's solve the problem. It's all like that whole element of, whoa, this is all crazy. That kind of has faded now with Jamie. So Roger says, the war, correctly interpreting my blank look. The British were, they are blockading and interrupting trade and seizing American ships right and left these days? What if we chose the wrong ship and ended up being sunk or captured? Or me being pressed into the British Navy, leaving Bree and the kids to decide whether to go through the stones by themselves or stay in Jamaica or wherever to try to find me. That's sensible, Jamie said. So I think just having been through Roger being lost in a different time and them spending all this time separated and terrified apart made them both not want to take a chance of ever being separated again. I mean, can you imagine that happening if that would have happened, Roger got pressed and all that other stuff? Oh my God, that would have been horrible. And I love this little nod of appreciation to Roger's thought process from Jamie and his respect that he thought through the way he thought everything through. So you took ship in 1739 then. How was it? Horrible, Bree said promptly, just as Roger said, terrible. And they looked at each other and laughed, though with an undertone that belied their mirth. It was the slightly nervous laughter of survivors who weren't yet entirely sure that they'd made it. So this ship passage sounds horrific. They're on this small merchant ship, 7.5 weeks, huddled in this smelly hold, eating cold porridge, raw potatoes, cheese with mites. Ew. Okay, that sounds disgusting. Bree, being the mother's daughter that she is, brought fruits and vegetables in her way, raisins and things like this at least. They were tossed to and fro to the point of being bruised all over. They went through 4 storms, huddled together for warmth, and the last one blew them into Savannah, south of where they intended to go. And so then they ended up having to take another fishing boat up the coast. Then we hear about the stones, and then we get some more description of what it's like inside of this passage to travel through the stones. And it seems that they got trapped in the space between. And it makes your mind go back to Claire saying she could hear screams of others who were trapped in the space and couldn't get out. Remember, I can't remember what book it was in, but it made me think of her saying that, now they were one of those people that were trapped in there and trying to get out. Roger thinks that they were holding on to different thoughts and memories. They were trying to remember all of their own personal memories of the Ridge and Jamie and Claire and all this other stuff. And finally it was Mandy and Jamie that pulled them through, which is like the two unlikely people, because Mandy has no firsthand knowledge of the Ridge and Jamie. She doesn't have her own memories of that. And Jamie is a non-traveler, so the fact that it's them that got them through is kind of interesting, and it was a fascinating thing to read how it happened. So you came to the stones at last then, Jamie said. How was it? We almost didn't make it, Roger said quietly. He looked at the children asleep on the settle. Mandy had fallen over and was sprawled on her face, limp as Esmeralda. It was Mandy who got us through. And you, he added, raising his eyes to Jamie with a slight smile. Me? You wrote a book, Bree said softly, looking at him, a grandfather's tales, and you thought to put a copy in the box with your letters. Jamie's face changed and he looked down at the floor, suddenly abashed. Ye read it? He asked and cleared his throat. We did. Over and over. Roger's voice was soft. And over, Bree added, her eyes warm with the memory. Mandy could recite some of her favorite stories word for word. Well, Jamie rubbed his nose. I think Jamie's so cute here, with all being embarrassed but pleased that she loved the little book that he wrote, which was so cute. Anyway, he says, but what has that to do with she found you? Roger said, in the stones. We were all thinking as hard as we could about you and Claire and the Ridge and everything we recalled, I suppose. Maybe it was too much, maybe too many different things. I can't begin to describe it, Bree said, and of course she couldn't, but the shadow of it lay on her face. We couldn't get out. We stepped through and it was kind of a little like exploding, Dad, she said, trying, but so slowly that you can sort of feel yourself coming apart. When we did it before, it was like that, but it was over pretty fast. This time, it didn't stop. I felt the memory of it at her words, and everything inside me lurched as though I'd been thrown off a cliff. Bree had gone pale, but she swallowed and went on. You can't really talk. You're sort of aware of who's with you. You're who you're holding on to. But Mandy and Jem they're kind of stronger than either Roger or me. And we could hear Mandy saying, "Granddad, blue pixie." And suddenly we were all on the same page, I guess you could say. Roger smiled at that and took up the story. "We were all thinking of you and that specific story, the one with the illustration of the blue pixie. And then we were lying on the ground, almost literally in pieces, but alive and in the right time and together." So a couple of things before I read this last line. First note, the blue pixie. I included an image in the description of this video. And when asked what this was to Diana said, "It's the Scots version of a pixie." Then she said, "For example, a mischievous small sprite," which is pretty much like Mandy. Okay, a mischievous small sprite. And then she said, "I gather the blue ones are particularly good at causing trouble." So take note of that. It's not just any pixie. It's a blue pixie. So I think we need to add blue to our list of buzzwords in this book, along with snakes and bees, because I've noticed it, Diana has been using it as a descriptor left and right, constantly keeping that color front of mind for us. Anytime something is described, it's blue. Blue everything. If you go back, even the chapter titles have blue, and descriptions of different things is really stressing blue. And it definitely seems like it's being done with intention. And I remember her saying that there's a reason the book is blue. So you can see her using it everywhere. I did a quick word search, and blue appears 215 times in this book. Red appears less than half, about 100. And red is a pretty frequently named color because of the red hair. So you see that mentioned a lot, naturally, to describe their hair. So that's going to be mentioned a lot. And still, it was only about 100 mentions compared to 215 blues. And then I did the other primary color, yellow, that was mentioned 62 times. So blue is far and above mentioned, way more of a considerable effort she's making hammering on blue. And in this case, the blue is connected to a supernatural power. So how incredible is that story? I absolutely loved it. I love that Mandy was the one that saved the day. And some feel that this is improbable. I saw a whole discussion, because now I could actually see chapter 7 to chapter 10 discussions. So I saw a whole discussion about, this seems improbable because Mandy has no real memories of Jamie and the Ridge, and Roger and Bree would be nuts to trust their fate to a 3-year-old with no real memory of her own to steer them home. For me, I have a few thoughts here to share on that. One is, we saw in the last chapter Diana talking about focusing on the simple things. And I think that's one point Roger was making, that they had so many memories, they didn't have a singular enough focus on one common simple thing. Mandy, being 3, would provide that. She doesn't have complex thoughts, and lots of different jumbled memories. She had one thing that she was focused on. Granddad, blue pixie story, and that's it. And it kind of gave them this one singular thing to focus on. And 2, they did not depend on her. These people saying that they depended on a child, they didn't depend on her. It's not like they went to the stones, pointed her at the stone, and said, "Take us to Granddad." granddad, They were in the midst of this. They were all just like thinking on their own of things, and they were lost in the in-between. They had no options. It wasn't like they just said, well, let's try this. They were in the middle of chaos and hell, and they had one thing that they could all hear Mandy thinking, and they all just kind of latched on and grabbed onto what they could. So it wasn't like a planned thing. And don't forget, number 3, Mandy is the most powerful of the 4. Okay, and they all know that. So if her focus is a single connection, there would be a lot of power in that single connection. Like in the thing, like you kind of have a sense of, this is what we need to do to survive. It's like your survival instinct kicks in, Number 4, she had heard stories about her grandparents all the time from her parents and brother. Jem talked about them in present tense. We remember them saying, and they would keep the children alive for them and all of this type of stuff. We constantly saw them talking about that. You get the impression, like, as she's growing up, they're constantly talking about granddad. You imagine, like, when they would play, Jemmy would probably tell her a lot of things. Granddad showed him this, Granny showed him that, blah, 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 blah. Also, number 5, she empathically feels what they feel. She's an empath, and she has a sense of them inside of her. And she feels, even though she didn't have personal experience that much with them, she feels their connection to them. Remember, she can feel kind of Jem's memories and his sense of fear and his emotional connections, his interior emotions. She's strongly connected through him. So because he loves them, like, she's automatically going to kind of empath that, 6, she has her own very real connection to Jamie's spirit. She would talk to his spirit, ghost, presence, whatever you want to call it, at the Brock. And Jamie would say, I don't talk to him, but I think Mandy does. Remember that. Also, Jamie had clear sight of her in his dreams. And he would come back and he would talk about her being feisty with baggage and how she would kick Jem and all these different little things that he remembered. So they had a connection built up. 7, Bree likely drew pictures of her parents to keep them alive for the kids. And if she did it before they left, which I think she probably would, that she surely did in the 5 months that they were in 1739, just to kind of keep bringing the parents and remembering what they looked like and putting that visual in front of them, because you knew they would need it. So of course she would do that. Then there was the book. Her book from her granddad. That Roger would say, that's you with granddad, and all that kind of stuff. And all the stories that he wrote, they said she knew by heart. And the Blue Pixie was her favorite. I hope at some point we hear Jamie tell her this story live, because I kind of want to see that. I think it would be cute. I think it would be very emotional for him knowing this saved them. I have a little Diana D on this very topic. She says, well, Bree and Roger would talk about Jamie and Claire quite a bit. Bree promised her parents that she and Roger wouldn't let the kids forget them. And Jamie wrote a small book for his grandchildren with a drawing of him and Amanda on his knee, though it was necessarily rather ambiguous, as he wouldn't have yet seen her as a small child, which Bree and Roger would have read to Jem and Mandy many times. Don't you feel you know the writer of a book that really touches you in some way? For what it's worth, thousands of people who read my books have told me that they feel as though they know me. And in fact, they do, if only in a limited sense, but a writer's soul shows in what they write, for good or ill. So I kind of love that quote from Diana. I adored Jamie's emotions over Mandy loving his book, memorizing his stories. It must have been very emotional for him. But then to find out that his entire family were lost in this chasm, and to hear that fear and dread in his daughter's voice, and knowing that he could not protect them in that time, and then only to learn then that his little granddaughter's love of his fun little stories, and such an inconsequential thing, like a little story about a blue fairy, that he wrote, that somehow something he did still protected and saved them, dumping them out, even though they felt like they were in pieces, but together and alive and in the right place. And it made me think of him, say to Roger when he woke up from the hanging, "You are alive, you are whole, all is well." It was kind of like that kind of a feeling. And Jamie is so emotionally overwhelmed that he sobs in his throat, and I started to cry with him when I read this. And then Jemmy, who woke up during this somehow, is just listening and adds the icing to the cake. Here's the last little line. Jamie made a small sound in his throat, the only inarticulate Scottish noise I've ever heard from him. I looked away and saw that Jem was awake. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were open. He sat up slowly and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It's okay, Grandad," he said, his voice froggy with sleep. "Don't cry. You got us here, safe." Oh, my goodness. What a great end to this section. Thoughts on the first section as a whole. I thought it was lovely and warm, a lot of joyfulness, a lot of reunion moments. I treasured having all the characters I love together, wrapped in love and support from each other, and the family that they've missed so much over the last 2 books. And while not a lot of drama happens, I think there will be times in the future where we'll be upset and then we'll come back and treasure these moments of this happy opening section, because I'm sure all this happy-go-lucky stuff is not going to last long. And still, we got some key moments, some foundation and introduction for things to come, and Jamie will now have the strength of 2 fellow protectors by his side. I forgot to highlight this last chapter, but I really loved how Jamie brought Ian and Roger to stand beside him on right and left when leading that hearth blessing, to pledge their oath with him to protect the family from danger and harm. I think it was an important moment for the future. Ian and Roger are kind of making like a public declaration to protect the home and its people, body and soul, which basically they kind of represent body and soul, the 2 of them. I am missing Lord John, so I hope we catch up with him soon in section 2. In the comments below, tell me your thoughts on this chapter and the story of the Mac's journey from 1739. What caused them to be stuck, do you think? Was it too many thoughts like Roger thought, or too many times that they've traveled now, or do you think it's something else? And also, we are ending a section here, so tell me what your overall section thoughts were. And what was your favorite moment in section 1, in the first section? So now, before I go, I want to mention today's Patreon B highlight. I will be doing these randomly now at the end of our lives. One of the benefits of being a top 3 support tier person, which are all named for our story locations, Lollybrock, Fraser's Ridge, and Craignadoon, is that each month you will get a shout out from me on one of these lives. At the moment, I have 10 of you in those 3 tiers. So I will spread out these moments as I'm doing these videos daily. I'll try to sporadically mention a person in each video. My first person is someone so very dear to my heart. It was really because of her that I am really doing this entire endeavor of Patreon. She encouraged me to take this leap, and as soon as I created this page, even before I had a handle on what the hell I was going to do with it exactly, she was the very first person to sign up, and at the top Craignadoon level. She stayed at that level for the couple months that I was in a fluster, finishing Moby and planning the Bees party, and was getting very little done with this page. I was super stressed out about that because I didn't want people to be paying for something and not getting something on the page, and she put me at ease, and several of you did. And I am talking about the wonderful Salima Mithani from London. She is so kind-hearted and shares insights as our resident psychologist. I love her dearly. I only wish she lived closer. I am hoping if I plan this Queen Bee's hive trip in July that I'm thinking about planning, she will make the trip across the pond and come. So thank you for all of your encouragement and support, Salima. Mwaz. See you next time, everyone, with Section 2, No Law East of the Pecos, Chapter 11, Lightning. Bye. Mwah.